Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Ingarani me Perepini te whakapaparanga mai, ko Leicester me Bristol te whenua tupu, ko Tamaki Makaurau te kāinga, he Industry Research Liaison Manager o New Zealand Food Safety Science and Research Centre, ko Kyla Archer toku ingoa. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for joining us for this June Food Science Seminar Spotlight webinar. We've taken a few months off to realign our comms plans into more of a campaign style, but we're now back and we're working out an exciting schedule of webinars for us. So today we're doing something a little bit new, and we'll be joined in conversation with our newest industry member, ALS Global. We have Steve Howes with us today, who is the Technical Services Director for Global Food and the Executive Director of ALS Food New Zealand. Steve has been part of the New Zealand analytical testing industry for almost 20 years, holding leadership and customer-facing roles over that time. He has an agricultural science degree from more years ago than he is prepared to admit, and is well connected with the primary production systems that are the backbone of New Zealand's food export sector. So Steve will be talking to us today around insights into European food safety regulations and how laboratories are helping New Zealand food industry navigate an increasingly complex global environment. So if you have any questions, I'll be hosting a Q&A with Steve at the end of his presentation. So please pop your questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So Steve, I will hand over to you now.
Thanks, Kyla. Kia ora, for Steve Howes toku ingoa. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you all today. I've actually decided to divide the presentation into a couple of parts. The first one is just a wee bit of an introduction to who ALS are. Some people might know, others might not, so I'll do that. And then we'll spend a few minutes just cruising through some observations about food safety regulations in Europe, the EU, to some extent the UK, but mainly the EU. I don't for a minute profess to be an expert in that, yet at the same time as part of a global organisation that's got a very strong capability in Europe, I've had the ability to become familiar with some of these things over the last few years, and I think probably it would be ideal if we can just treat whatever I'm going to say as a bit of a teaser or an intro into some topics that I think are relevant for us as in a food industry in New Zealand, and then we can just get into a conversation later on about anything that comes along. Right, so getting into it, insights into EU food safety regulations. I just acknowledge that I've got a colleague here on the call, Bob Cuff, who's our business development manager, and I'll show you a photo of what Bob looks like a little bit later on in the presentation. Before I begin, I'll share in a moment how our organisation became part of ALS a few years ago. One of the things that ALS did that I noticed right from the get-go was a real strong focus on safety, and in fact we have this I guess tradition when we're doing presentations or having meetings that we spend a minute at the start doing a safety moment, which is just an acknowledgement of the fact that safety, rather than being something that sits in the background, we need to keep bringing it to the fore to make sure that people are able to be safe in their workplace and in the things they do. So I'm going to do a little safety moment for us all as we go. And funnily enough, this one is actually a very current one from within the organisation. It's a theme that we are focusing on across the outfit at the moment, which has to do with mobile phone use while driving. I think we all know theoretically that the use of mobile phones when we're driving vehicles is dangerous. I think there's a lot of us, though, also that sort of almost treat it like, yes, it is, but actually that's probably more dangerous for other people than it is for us. Now, the truth is that if we're using mobile phones while we're driving, it's going to create significant risk of injury or accident, whether it's because we're distracted as we're using the phone ourselves, looking at the screen or whatever. It can also be, though, that even using hands-free in the phone is something which can be distracting for us, especially if we're having quite an engaged conversation with somebody else. So I would just, as part of the safety moment, encourage all of you to be considering what mobile phone practices that you regard as being safe. What are the sorts of practices that you would like to see your children or your loved ones following in order for them to be safe. And then take care to follow those practices for yourself, partly because it's going to keep you safe, but it's also going to be an important way of setting a good example for friends and family and colleagues. And if you're in a role where you are a leader or you're looked at as somebody who others look up to, those things are always really important. So there we go. There's a safety moment for you to consider as we go forward. Now, what I thought I would do at the start is just give you a quick overview of ALS, and I've gone and grabbed the corporate slides. Now, I've deleted some, and I'm not going to go through them all, but there's just a few things in here that I'll share that gives you an idea of the organisation. ALS, which is an acronym standing for Australian Laboratory Services, is an organisation that's present now in 70 countries, or more than 70 countries around the world. At around about 450 different laboratory or other sort of operational locations, over 20,000 staff, and the AUD revenue is getting close to $3 billion. So it's one of the largest of the testing, inspection and certification organisations in the world. The organisation actually began about 180 years ago. I'll come to this on the next slide. And it's what this photo on the left of the screen here depicts. It was actually a chemicals company based in Brisbane. These days, it's evolved very much through to being a laboratory services sort of testing, inspection, certification organisation. As I say, spread in many places around the world. So the history of it is this company called Campbell Brothers was established in Australia back in 1863 as a chemical company, and it got listed on the Aussie Stock Exchange in the 1950s. The laboratory services part began in the mid-70s when the Campbell Brothers, well, ALS began in the mid-70s, but Campbell Brothers acquired the laboratory business in 1981, and it turned into quite a sort of a turning point for the organisation, because Campbell Brothers then actually decided to rename themselves as ALS, or Australian Laboratory Services. They expanded from Brisbane across Australia, and then they expanded into other parts of the world, which then led to them being the organisation that we are now. The kind of breakdown of where we are operating and what we do, on the left of the screen here, you can see a rough breakdown of the areas of work we're involved with. Commodities like minerals and industrials is around about a third of the business. Environmentals, about a third of the business. And the balance of it is in what the company refers to as life sciences, which is largely food and pharmaceutical. I do laugh because in my mind, life sciences these days needs to also encompass a lot of genomics and DNA testing and that kind of thing. And we do have some of that capability, but it's not the life sciences that some people who are more involved in biotech might consider. And I'll come to these categories a bit more on the next screen. By geography, you can see in here that we have a reasonable spread across Asia Pacific and Europe and the Americas. You know, broadly a third of our company's business is across those areas. We do have a small footprint in Africa as well, but that African footprint bears little or no relevance to the food industry. It's largely in the mining, services, commodities type of space as well. Sorry, I just took that the wrong direction. And so if we look at our market sector verticals that we're involved with, environmental, oil and lubricants. The oil and lubricants business grew, I think, largely out of the mining services, because you end up with a lot of gear that's being used on those mining sites, which they need help for around the maintenance and ongoing diagnostics of, and that's where the oil and lubricants business came from. Mining and commodities, as I've referred to. Food and beverage, very strong business with quite a wide network right across the world. And then in the pharmaceuticals, healthcare, beauty and personal care space, strongly oriented towards the European and US markets, but we do have some offerings in the pharmaceutical, beauty and personal care space in Asia as well. So I'm not going to cover most of these areas at all in the conversation, but if anyone has any particular questions about them, you can bring them up at the end or contact me separately. That's absolutely fine. Now, the New Zealand business, which has become a member of the association, while we're called ALS Food New Zealand, actually we are an evolution from a Kiwi startup that took place in 2011 called Analytica Laboratories. Analytica came into existence on the campus at the Ruakura Research Centre in Hamilton, which is where I'm still sitting today. And just a few little cartoons there, I suppose, to demonstrate that our initial involvement was in two spaces. Up the top, the dairy cow. So we were quite involved in a lot of dairy related testing, especially raw milk quality testing. And also at the bottom, our little mad scientist friend, the company's always been built around a commercial research and development, non-routine project type testing capability as well. It's effectively a function where if people need to get something unusual done and it relates to chemistry, usually we can find a way of managing to do a project for them that will enable that to happen. And again, we can cover off on more detail of that if anybody has any questions about that. Over time, we became involved in the New Zealand honey industry. Then we also set up methods to assist with the methamphetamine on surfaces type segment that emerged a few years ago, and became involved in environmental testing as well. So we have things like IANZ accreditation, ISO 17025, MPI recognised laboratory program approval for some of our food tests that are relevant to that. We've also got a GLP approval as well, so we can carry out some of our commercial R&D projects to help people with regulatory testing requirements. So that Analytica Laboratories startup in 2017 became part of a small Australian stock market listed company called HRL Holdings. And that itself in 2022 was acquired by ALS. And so, if you like, we became part of ALS through an acquisition, but it always fitted with the kind of goal that we had is that we wanted an organisation that was going to be more than just a small Kiwi startup. We wanted it to be something that was globally connected, and was able to be much bigger than just the one or two people that began it. And being part of ALS, that's very much part of who we are. And on the way through, there was a few other things that we did. There's a laboratory here called CAIQ Test Pacific. Analytica became involved as a founding shareholder of that in 2015, which is still sitting on the same campus as where I am now. That has got not only IANZ, but also CNAS accreditation for a wide range of food testing methods, especially focused on the dairy industry, but also able to support people in the honey and the supplements sector as well. Food Lab Pacific is a joint venture laboratory that was set up with Milk Test New Zealand. That took place sometime in or around sort of COVID time. And that lab was designed to have us expand scope into the general foods area. And so these days on the right of the screen there, we would describe ourselves as a lab with not only specialised testing capabilities here in New Zealand along historical lines, but a growing general food testing capability as well. All right, so that just gives you a wee bit of an overview of who we are and why we are here. And we're really pleased to have a chance to be part of an association that cares about New Zealand food safety, as much as anything, sort of helping to build and grow the prosperity of the New Zealand food industry, which of course is very much a global industry and is very strongly focused on export and providing safe food to the world as well. So in the next section, what I thought I would do is summarise a wee bit about the European food safety context scenario. which is something that I've been forced to become personally more familiar with it in a more of a globally oriented food role. ALS has a really strong presence in Europe with a network of food labs across the EU as well as the UK. And what that means is that I've had the ability to learn about testing, which is done there that aligns with regulations in that part of the world. I've had a chance to meet and get to know subject matter experts and the regulations that apply there. The other interesting part of it too is that we've got quite significant relationships as an organisation with European-based retailers, food manufacturers, and actually a number of global organisations that are working globally, but they're European-based, and they tend to be strongly oriented towards the European regulatory environment when they're considering what they expect from their global suppliers. And some of you will be familiar with the likes of a Nestle or a Danone or a Lactalis, or, you know, we can rattle off a number of these names. They're all people that our organisation has got strong relationships with. And what we know is that if we can understand what they require in Europe, often that's a very good insight into what they're going to require of us in other parts of the world as well. So if you think about European food regulations, on the surface of things, they can feel really quite overwhelming. Some people might call them overly bureaucratic. Actually, these things always exist for a reason, and it's important to consider the context of Europe when thinking about the regulations that they've got. I guess the first point I'd make is the European Union is a really large common market, and you only realise that when you get up there and you're travelling around, as many of you will have done, and you arrive at a border between two EU countries, and it's kind of like an open border. You just go straight through. There's no issues. And that doesn't just apply to humans traveling through the border. It applies to goods that are moving around as well. And that is quite a different experience to when you are coming from outside the EU into the EU, as people in the UK have discovered since Brexit. So in that common market, they need a level playing field so that all of their members have a common set of rules that they are playing by in a range of areas. And that level playing field then also needs to apply to food that's being imported into it as well. And remember that the EU is a net importer of many food products, as well as there being a lot of movement around the EU from some member states to others. The key point there, a lot of the food that's consumed in the EU is consumed by people who are completely disconnected from where it's come from. So they have to place a lot of reliance on the retailers or the places they buy the food from to be sure that it's safe. But there's also a high reliance on the EU and the regulatory environment to give them confidence that food is safe and authentic and all of those other things as well. There's a real interesting history of food fraud and scandal in the EU, and you'll all know examples of these. But you know, the consumers, they're almost like punch drunk these days as a consequence of some of these things having played out. You know, one example is the very historical thing where you've got persistent organic pollutants or heavy metals that are found in food and in water that are the legacy of industrialization over decades, if not centuries, across the continent. And as a consequence, there's this ongoing risk of the presence of these things in food that's being consumed inside the EU. Certainly, there's every chance you're going to find residues of chemicals that are being used for plant protection or animal veterinary medicines in food. And so they've got very strict regulations in relation to those. And then you get into the food fraud scandals that have played out over time, which every time they happen just reinforce to people just how worried they are about the stuff that they're buying. You know, the origins of MOSH and MOA are all about people in the Ukraine having decided that it's a good idea to put used tractor engine oil into food grade oils as a way of making a little bit more money. You'll be familiar with the horse meat scandal, which is where this little graphic on the side of the screen comes from, with a picture of no horses over the top of the meat counter in a supermarket, but where horse meat from one part of Europe was found to be having been processed and then being sold as beef in other parts of Europe. The addition of sugar syrups to honey is something that falls quite close to home for countries like New Zealand, where we export a lot of honey around the world, including to Europe, and there's always that question about whether there's been the adulteration of honey with sugar. So many more examples that you can come up with, but all of that creates this context of a regulatory environment where it feels quite prescriptive and quite onerous, but it's the approach that they feel they need to take to make sure that things are safe. And arguably at times, some people might look at that and say it's a bit over the top, but it comes against the backdrop of what we've got going on here. Now, when you talk about food contaminants, the main European Union regulation related to this is 2023/915. So 2023 obviously means it was enacted in 2023, although when that happened, it was a bit of a rewrite and refresh of a previous regulation that was replaced by this one. This is the regulation that is the primary source of maximum residue limits for a range of food contaminants, and I'll show you those on the next page. The regulation applies to food. That's very clear in its definitions. It applies to food being placed on the market by a food business operator. Now, I'm not going to turn into a lawyer and try and just define those things for you. You can find those definitions inside the EU regulations if you want to. But essentially what it's saying is that when somebody decides that they're going to place food on the market in Europe, they are regarded as being responsible for making sure that food is safe. And that food safety in regard to food contaminants is defined in significant part by this regulation. What the regulation says is if you find that the food that you've got that you want to place in the market's got contaminants that are above the maximum residue limit, you are not allowed to take that food and then expose it to some sort of a chemical detoxification process to make it better. You're just not allowed to put it on the market for consumers to buy. Although what it does say is there's an exception where those foods are being sold not to consumers, but they're sold as an ingredient that's going to be used in further food manufacture. Under that circumstance, you are still required to disclose what the levels of these contaminants might be, but the party using that food as an ingredient is allowed to reduce their concentrations in the final product through physical processes like blending or sorting, and then that can be used to effectively dilute them down and make them get to a level where they meet their requirements. So there is a requirement for ingredients that have got levels of contaminants in them that are going to be used for ingredient purposes to be clearly labelled as such. So I've done you the favour of going through the regulation, and here's the summary of the compounds that are in the current version of it, which have got maximum residue limits associated with them. I'm certainly not going to go through them all in detail, but you can see that they're broken down into categories, and in fact these categories are represented in these regs: fungal toxins and other plant toxins. Then you've got heavy metals, you've got some persistent organic pollutants, then processing contaminants and other contaminants as well. The point I'd make about these is that while these ones are specified in the version of these regulations that are there now, the regulations are constantly being modified and being added to, and I'll refer to that in relation to MOSH and MOA just a little bit later on. And so if you want to get copies of these regulations, it is important to go to the EU website and download the most recent version, because they do make sure the most recent versions on the website does have up-to-date information about any of these things on there as well. Pesticide residues in veterinary medicines aren't captured under that other regulation. They're actually covered through under separate regulations. So for pesticide residues, which is things like insecticides and fungicides and herbicides. The main regulation that applies here is EC 396-2005. Now, brace yourself, this one's over 4,000 pages long. So you'll forgive me if I didn't go through that in detail and do a table like I did on the other page for you. I'll let you do that yourself if you really want to. There are regular amendments to this one. In fact, if you download the most current one, the first 3, 4, or 5 pages of it is just a list of all of the amendments that have come in since this was first issued in 2005. So it's a really good example of where you don't want to get that original version. You need to get the most up-to-date one. One key component or element to this is that in addition to the long list of pesticides, ag chem, which are specifically included in here with MRLs, there's also a provision that says that there's a default maximum residue limit of 0.01 milligrams per kilogram that applies to any of these kinds of compounds if they're not specified in these regulations. So in other words, the regulation is all-encompassing because it provides specific MRLs for many things, but it also says in absence of this, just use 0.01 milligrams per kilogram as your guideline to try and work out whether something is safe and able to be put on the market in Europe. Veterinary medicines are different. The main regulation related to this is EC 470-2009. Just like the other one, it's regularly updated, so you should get the current version of it all the time. But this is different in that it includes the concept of prohibited compounds where there is no safe maximum residue limit. At the very end of these regulations, if you go to the last page, you'll see a list of, I can't remember, 15 or 20 compounds where they're basically saying there's not enough information available to establish an MRL, and so on that basis, we're going to call these prohibited. I'm presuming that this is because as veterinary medicines or compounds that are biologically or metabolically active in animals that are similar-ish to humans, the last thing that they want to do is just put some sort of a blanket there that says, well, in absence of anything else, you can get away with not very much. That they're actually kind of saying, in absence of having a clear answer, just don't do it. So you do need to take extra special care with vet meds and how you interpret the presence of those in foods that are being sold or marketed in a market like the EU as well. Now, what I'm going to do is just dive now into 2 or 3 slightly more topical areas because they're areas of sort of active work or evolution. The first one is PFAS. Many of you will be familiar with PFAS, these forever chemicals which have arisen from a range of man-made sort of industrial applications over the years, firefighting foams, things that create water repellency, non-stick coatings for surfaces of cookware, and the list goes on. Contrary to popular opinion, while there are literally tens of thousands of these things, there are actually only 4 PFAS that currently have maximum residue limits in the contaminants regulation. And those are PFOS, PFOA, PFNA, and PFHXS. So if you go to those contaminant regulations I talked to you about before, you'll find those listed there with individual MRLs, as well as a sort of an MRL for total of those 4. But the MRLs are limited to only animal-derived products like meat, edible offal, eggs, shellfish, and fish. In other words, a pretty narrow range of PFAS and a pretty narrow application to food sample types. Don't be fooled into thinking, though, that this is the end of the story. In 2022, the EU put out this regulation 2022-1431. Now, that includes 22 more PFAS, including some of the more modern PFAS like Gen X and others, as well as 2 categories of PFAS, which is the fluorotelema or FTOH and FTS, fluorotelema sulfonates and fluorotelema alcohols. And there was the intention that testing would be done on a much wider range of foods. Now, there were no MRLs included there. The regulation did specify a detection limit that they would like to see laboratories able to test down to for these things. And the purpose of it appears to have been gathering data on the presence of this wider range of PFAS in a wider range of foods. I think that based on this, we can expect that the EU is now in possession of data about a wider range of PFAS and how often they are found in different kinds of food. And my guess is that we can expect the requirement to test for PFAS in food is likely to grow in the future. So as a result of that, if you go to, say, our laboratory in Italy that does this, or indeed other labs in Europe who are doing this testing, you'll find that they don't have a method that is limited to those 4 above. You'll find that their methods usually include those 4 plus the 22, plus at the very least some of either the fluorotelema alcohols or sulfonates or both that are in food, so that people can get information about that with a future-looking focus, if you like, as well. There'd be some wisdom, I would say, for New Zealanders who are exporting to Europe to be considering doing a similar thing. MOSH and MOA is another one. Again, I talked about this before in the context of history. This arose because of some very gross adulteration of human edible vegetable oils with used mineral oils that arose from industrial uses. But back in those days, the level of adulteration was very high. And these days, I think that context has been perhaps lost a little. Certainly, the detection limits or the levels that are regarded as safe now are orders of magnitude lower than was being experienced previously. MOSH and MOA is not currently included in that EU contaminants list, but I understand the European Commission is considering an amendment to that, which will include MOA, and that could be as soon as 2027. However, the story doesn't end there. In the EU, there is another food regulation which places an obligation on people that are placing food on the market to not place food on the market that is unsafe, that they know to be unsafe. And so, irrespective of whether things are included specifically in regulations or not, if people are aware that something is unsafe, they are expected to not sell it, or if they become aware of it, to withdraw it and recall it from sale. Now, member states in Europe have already agreed on maximum residue limits for MOA in foods at levels which, while they're not included in EU 2023-915, effectively those levels appear to be being regarded as levels that should be referred to if people are trying to consider whether foods with residues of MOA in them are safe for sale under that other general food safety regulation. So I think the message here is that there actually are current requirements for MOA in food in Europe. Those are at relatively low levels, and we can also expect to see those strengthened soon by having them included through an amendment to that EU 2023/915. Testing for this is complicated and expensive. It requires quite sort of unique and very bespoke equipment, which is starting to be deployed in labs where there's sufficient volume to justify it in Europe. Whereas it's a bit more difficult to find places who will do it outside of Europe because it requires enough volume to justify it. But nonetheless, the testing capability exists and is very readily available in Europe if needed. The new one that's on the radar is packaging materials. And this has been underway for a long time, but Regulation EU 2025/40 has come into force and in fact later this year becomes something that is in effect and impacting on people who are selling food in Europe. It relates to packaging and packaging waste, not just for food, but for everything that's placed on the market there. And there's a range of requirements for packaging materials. It includes outer packaging. It also includes food contact materials, and those things are treated as being different to each other because food contact materials are seen as being things that present a higher risk to the introduction of contaminants into food. So you get things like maximum residue limits for heavy metals, for PFAS. There's a restriction on the use of BPA in plastics. There's a requirement that packaging materials, with a few exceptions, either have to be designed to be able to be recycled at scale in Europe or composted, either composted industrially or able to be composted at home. And there's also a requirement that people who are placing things on the market are actively considering how they can reduce packaging waste. If you're using plastic packaging, there's requirements around them having a minimum recycled content. I talked about packaging waste, but there's also packaging minimization as well. So an expectation that people are going to find ways of minimizing how much packaging materials used to achieve the outcome they need to, as well as labeling requirements that are very specific and designed to help consumers correctly dispose of packaging material after it's been used. This is causing quite a lot of confusion and a number of questions even inside the EU at the moment, with food manufacturers and food retailers not being sure about how to comply. They're very extensive regulations. I guess the point here is that people who are producing food that is sold inside the EU, or even food that is being exported to the EU, which is packaged even for use inside food manufacturing facilities as an ingredient, they are going to need to ensure that their product packaging meets the requirements of the regulation. And as you can see, that goes beyond just wondering about whether it's going to have some contaminants in it to a range of other things as well. Right, so there's sort of some comments about the general context of the EU, as well as a wee bit of a focus into some of the regulations and a few sort of case studies or topical things at the moment. My summary would be that the European Union is a really different world to the one that we live and work in, because of a number of the things I just spoke about. We offer a local touch to that market through our Hamilton-based laboratory, because we've got the ability to connect with people in Europe who are very familiar with regulations, how they're applied, as well as access to labs who've got the instruments and methods that enable you to understand whether your food or ingredients meet regulatory requirements or what you need to do to change that. And to give you some examples, we've got a number of labs that do pesticides and vet medicine testing, but our German and UK hub laboratories are real experts in that. PFAS we tend to do through our lab in Italy, though we do have some current capability here in New Zealand, which includes the use of high resolution mass spec for untargeted analysis if you're really wanting to open the kimono and go deep into understanding what's going on with food or other things. We've got MOSH and MOA testing set up in one of our labs in Germany. We can do compostability testing in France, and quite a range of consumer product testing, which includes migration testing of contaminants out of food contact materials and things in places like Germany and Spain as well. So just to finish before we jump into any questions, there you go. There's Bob. who's our business development manager here in New Zealand and probably your primary contact in New Zealand, and then a photo of myself that I've managed to rustle up, which I like using because it's 10 years old, so it makes me look younger than I am. But I'm also based here in Hamilton, and provide some ongoing support to the work we do here, but I've also got a bit of a global focus related to some things, including PFAS, actually, and pesticide residue analysis as a couple of examples. And look, that's that. So I'm going to hit escape. I'm going to stop. I'm going to try and find a way of stopping sharing. And I'm going to pass it back to you.
There we go.
Kyla, so if you've got any questions that we want to cover, I can do it.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that, Steve. It's really helpful. One, having someone not wade through 4,000 pages of text, but just to sort of think, pick out the key ones that need to be addressed and looked at, and then also looking at the key chemicals of concern, which should be nothing new to anybody that's on here. So we've had a couple of questions through, and I actually received one yesterday. So this relates to testing limits and limit of quantification and limit of detection. So we're constantly seeing tighter limits from either regulators or customers for contaminants overseas, where our domestic labs are unable to report down to that level, such as phthalates and PFAS. What are our domestic labs doing to stay ahead of these changes, or specifically what are ALS Global doing?
Yes, I mean, organisations like ours, there's two things that we will do, and often for a lab, it doesn't matter whether it's at us or somebody else. The ability to invest in the not insignificant work that's required to improve methods, get lower detection limits. Sometimes that requires investment in new testing, more sensitive testing equipment. Does very much depend on the degree of local demand that there is likely to be for that. So the way that we would approach that is that we've got connection to global laboratories that are capable of doing these things. And so we facilitate and manage the shipment and transport of samples to there if required. If people have got a significant or ongoing requirement for testing, we're very happy to hear about that, because we can actually bring methods from our labs overseas back here and get them set up. There's also always the ability to do one-off projects. So if somebody's, for instance, sitting there and saying, look, I don't need this in an ongoing way, but I want to do a bit of a study into a whole group of my ingredients or whatever it is that's required, then there's always ways of doing one-off or non-routine type testing work that's needed. I think the most important thing is for people that need something, just reach out and talk with us or whoever your laboratory partner is to explain what you require. Because the more we are hearing from people about that, the more we're able to aggregate that demand together and then consider what the best response to it is in terms of local capability versus finding others to do it.
Yeah, and sort of on that point, and I know that you and I have had this discussion before, but sort of relating to that and the Mosh and Moa discussion, the centre is looking at this capability sort of as a New Zealand whole, because I know that there's sort of increased demand coming in, potentially more coming through. And I know that you are also keen to hear from industry, but I think as the centre is well placed as a sort of collective of many of the willing to help sort of coordinate that answer. So if there is anybody that is listening right now, if you do want to let us know sort of with your requirements from your customers or from expectations of your regulators or within your companies, for how frequently you might want to access a testing capability for Mosh and Moa within New Zealand, we'd love to hear from you around that, and so we can then start having those conversations and start putting that network together of how we can best ensure that this testing capability is available within New Zealand and how it's best utilised, and the best investment going to the right place so that it's not too difficult for labs to access, and it's not too difficult for industry to access. So yeah, please drop me an email at k.archer@massey.ac.nz if you have any views on that. So just a little quick plug there. So I've got another couple of questions. So someone has asked, under PPWR, has it yet to be clarified what tests will be required for PFAS to show compliance with the required limit?
Yes, it has been. There was actually it was quite unclear in the original regulations, or at least a bit ambiguous. So there's recently been a sort of an FAQ / sort of explanatory note that's come out, which is they've made it quite clear it's not designed to replace the other regulations, but it's designed to provide some interpretation. So essentially, the way that it works is for PFAS. And in the context of food, it doesn't apply to outer packaging. It only applies to food contact materials. There's basically a waterfall testing requirement associated with it. The first thing that's expected actually is that people will just sit down and do a desktop review of the packaging material that they're using and identify any particular risk that might be associated with it. So if you're using a packaging material where you know that there's the potential that a particular PFAS may have been used in its manufacture, even if that's not explicitly included in one of the testing suites that's available from a laboratory, you are required to take account of that in terms of your investigation into that packaging material. So if you there is that onus on you to take responsibility for that. But the testing cascade looks like a total fluorine analysis. Usually that's done by a sort of a combustion ion chromatography type method. The problem with that is that by definition, a total fluorine test by CIC is going to detect all fluorine. It's going to detect inorganic as well as organic fluorine, so you can get false positives that way. So if you have a result that is less than 50 milligrams per kilogram or parts per million using that method, that's regarded as being compliant with the regulations. If you have a result above 50, you're expected to do some more investigation. So the next piece of investigation that you might choose to do is a total organic fluorine test. So in other words, using some sort of a technique that's designed to isolate the organic fluorine in the sample and test that. And theoretically, that's where your PFAS fraction is going to be. The problem with that is some of those total organic fluorine methods are variable in terms of their ability to measure all of the PFAS which are there. So some people choose to ignore that step and move to the third one, which is a targeted method. And that targeted method talks about doing a couple of things. It talks about using a total oxidizable precursors assay or a top assay. That's one that's designed to do a digestion on the sample and convert a number of the PFAS that are in there into some products of oxidation that are more readily measured through a targeted method. And if you do that, then you do a targeted method. If you've got more than 250 parts per billion in total of any PFAS that are there, that's regarded as being non-compliant. Or if in the process of doing that, if you find that you've got more than 25 parts per billion of any one individual PFAS, it's also regarded as being non-compliant. So there's quite a lot there. And it's still very much establishing itself as a way of going about evaluation because it's relatively new. And it'd be fair to say there's a reasonable amount of confusion even in Europe about that amongst people. So if we are confused here, there's no surprises. But that doesn't mean to say that we're not going to have to comply with it because we are. Yeah.
Well, it's a tricky one to navigate, but yeah, sounds very like there's some very good logical steps to take to sort of help.
And that would be a good example of where I think we would be unwise to be trying to do that analysis here. We're actually best to find laboratories in Europe that have got expertise, and there are a number of them who've really leaned into this packaging materials, packaging waste area and developed capability they feel confident is aligned with the regulations. And in the early stages, that's probably a safer option than somebody trying to cobble something together here and then discovering later on that they're in trouble as a result of that.
Yeah, no, very good points. I've got one more question here, and I think it's more related to the ALS global side of things rather than the regulations that we were talking about.
Sure.
Someone's asked, are you doing any projects in the space of traditional Māori kai and alignment to FSAN's food standards code?
We do a number of projects related to a range of different things, which includes Māori involvement with Māori and Māori groups that are interested in understanding the characteristics of traditional foods, traditional medicines, all of those kinds of things. So yes, we are. It's hard to be very specific about it for confidentiality reasons. It's hard to be too general about it either, because each of those projects are different in terms of the outcomes that people are wanting. But nonetheless, yes, we have a range of involvements with that kind of thing.
Okay, great. That's good to hear. I think that's it for questions, unless anybody's got anything burning that pops up. Just to follow up on another point that you raised around the packaging. So the Centre and the Bioeconomy Science Institute will be organising a packaging workshop. So some of you might have completed a previous survey around this to sort of help understand the industry needs and requirements. So this will be in Auckland at the end of October. The program's being put together now, but it's looking good, and further details will be sent out soon, but it will be in Auckland at the end of October. Yeah, no more questions have come in, so I'll wrap up. So thank you for your time today, Steve. I know we've had a lot of scheduling issues trying to make this happen, but pleased that we were able to get this off the ground, and it's really interesting to hear. And well, it's also good for me to hear that it's things that aren't new, and so it's things that are already being thought about. But yeah, I'm grateful to have some expert deep dive into it. Our next webinar will be on the 23rd of July, and will be from our very own Dr. Wendy Newport-Smith, who many of you will know as the Centre's Associate Director of Operations, and Professor Miranda Morosa, and they will be talking about food safety culture and the new network of food safety culture champions that we're building across Aotearoa. So registration details will be sent out in the next couple of weeks, and just a couple of events coming up soon. So we've got the relating to that food safety culture community of practice. There will be a workshop in Auckland on the 11th of August to establish that network. But then sooner than that, if you wanted to see us sooner, we will be at NZFSSRC in Auckland next week from Tuesday to Thursday. And the Centre has organised all of the food safety sessions, and we would love to see you there. So I think that wraps us up for today. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your week, and we hope to see you soon. Ka kite.